about abortion now. Yeah. Speaking of abortion, anyway, obviously this is one of the more serious, I think, one of the most serious moral issues of our time. Seems that people on both sides are relatively entrenched, from what I can tell, in their respective positions. It doesn't mean that people don't change their minds. That wouldn't be fair either. People do. The catch with what we're dealing with is how political this topic has become. And the way that I look at it is not primarily a political issue. It is primarily a theological issue. And I know when I say that means people are like, well, you can't impose your religion on me. I think it's not the imposition of the religion on anybody. I'm just saying there's something that comes before politics. And even if you were to say, well, it can't be your religion because that's an imposition, you would still have the moral question before you have the political answer. I mean, if you look at, if you get into, like even often in law school, they have to get into ethics because there's a connection between ethics and law, or at least there's supposed to be, because what you're legislating, usually there is a moral dimension to it, and you're trying to protect some things. Now, I'm aware that there are differences in what the grounding of that morality is when you go to law school. For example, is it natural law, where it is connected to something that is, so to speak, infused into the world itself? Or is it positivism, which is kind of the other main theory in law school, which doesn't make that necessary connection? I get it. I get all of that stuff. But for me, I do think we want to take seriously a couple of things. Deuteronomy chapter 30. When making a choice between life and death, it says choose life. Choose life. And one of the reasons that I think that is there is not just because you have the value of life, but we do. But it's also because of what happens if you're making a mistake. Right? So even when it comes to the death penalty, I always make this distinction. Do I think you can make a moral argument for the death penalty and still be pro-life? And the answer is yes, you can. The reason for that is not because I'm taking somebody's life. It's because in virtue of something that they've done, maybe like multiple murders, they have forfeited their right to life. They gave it up themselves. I see a moral distinction there. And I could simultaneously say that and in the same breath say something like this. However, given that what we're dealing with here is the potential loss of life, we reserve the right to not execute a person, especially in cases where it's, we're not confident. Does that make sense? Why? Because we value life. Though you can say both of those things simultaneously. Scripture does speak about this. If you look at Jeremiah 1:5, it tells us that God knows us before He even formed us in the womb. Or famously, Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16, speaks of God's role in our creation and His participation of the formation of us in the womb. There's a passage, even in Genesis chapter 1, we are made in God's image. There's something that's unique and special and beautiful. But there's this passage in Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 to 25, that I'll tell you is a debated passage, and I'm going to get it out here on my Bible, on my phone, because this is the one that, as I've found in the literature, pro-choice advocates have gone to justify a pro-choice position. So if you look at Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 to 25, and I'm scrolling down to find it now, here's what it says. It says, when men get in a fight and hit a pregnant woman so that her children are born prematurely, but there is no injury, the one who hit her must be fined as the woman's husband demands from him, and he must pay according to the judicial assessment. If there's an injury, then you must give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, bruise for bruise, and wound for wound. Now, why would somebody point out Exodus 21, 22 to 25 and say, it seems like they're making a moral distinction here between the life in the womb and the mother's life? I want to kind of show you where that comes from. the big idea is this. This passage of Scripture, it's kind of packed in a list of laws about fighting and quarreling. I quoted these to my brothers all the time growing up. And so you got the picture here. It pictures a situation where two men are fighting, and the wife of one of them intervenes to make peace. Did you catch that? She's struck, and the blow results in the miscarriage or premature birth. Did you catch that as we were reading it? So the pro-choice reasoning assumes that a miscarriage occurs here. And the result of it is because of the strike itself. Does that make sense? There's a strike. As a result of the strike, there is an early birth. The Revised Standard Version, some of you, it's called the RSV. The Revised Standard Version is one translation that they go to actually support this view. When men strive together and hurt a woman with child so that there's a miscarriage, and yet no harm follows, the one who hurt her shall be fined, according as the woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, and whatnot. Here's what the RSV did in translation, and I'm just saying this up front. Translations matter. Okay. They matter. It's one of the reasons I did Greek and Hebrew, in seminary. I was like, this is going to matter. The RSV assumes a miscarriage happens and that the fetus is born dead. And this implies, as the argument goes, that the loss of the unborn is no harm. Did you just catch that? That's what the RSV does. They assume, let me say it again, they assume that the fetus is born dead, and this implies that the loss of the unborn is no harm. You remember the word harm that was brought up in those verses, because it says, and I quote one more time, if there is a miscarriage and yet no harm follows, this is where they get it, it's possible for the blow to cause a miscarriage and yet not count that as harm. Now, if it were, what would you do? And the answer is, it would be an eye for an eye, life for a life, right? So the pro-choice side, so this would be more of a liberal interpretation of this passage in Exodus 20. And I'm not trying to use that label. I'm just trying to, it is, a more liberal translation would interpret it that way. Because what it does is it pulls a moral equivalence, or moral distinction, between the life in the womb and the mother. Do you catch that? Because notice what happens. Well, if you lose the child, then what would the penalty for it be? Based on this. Well, you might have to render some cash or something, but it's not life for life. However, if harm falls to the mother, it's life for life. Harm for harm. You catch that? That's kind of how they get to it. But here's the question. Is that the right way to translate this? And this is where I think I want to give a little bit of pushback. I wanted to start with the theological aspect first, and then we'll get into some philosophical stuff here in just a second. Is it the right translation? I think the answer to that is no, but I want to tell you why. If you were to look at something like the New International Version or the NIV, it does not assume that a miscarriage happened. Look at the NIV. It translates it like this. See if you hear a difference. If men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life. Do you see a difference in the reading here? If so, and I'm just saying this out, what do you hear that is different? Do what?
No miscarriage, just an early birth without any complications.
Yeah, it's an early birth without any complications, right? So the question becomes, okay, so why should we take that interpretation? Welcome to hermeneutics, right? So if you were to ever do hermeneutics in seminary, it just regards to the proper interpretation of Scripture. And there are passages of Scripture that are honestly debated because they're difficult. I'm going to give you some reasons for taking this interpretation. Really, I'm going to focus on three, even though I've got a lot more, but I'm going to give you three. All right? There is a Hebrew word for miscarry, or lose by abortion, or be bereaved of the fruit of the womb, namely shakal. It's S-H-A-K-A-L. We have a word for this, right? And so sometimes you just have to start there. Do they have something that's in their vernacular that actually means a miscarriage? And if the answer is no, then you go, oh, okay, well, probably, maybe this would fit like that. But we do have a word in the Hebrew for miscarriage. It's used nearby in Exodus chapter 23, verse 26. It says, "None shall miscarry or be barren in your land." Okay? But this word is not used here in Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 to 25. So just 2 chapters over, you have the clear use of the word miscarry. That word does not have the same use or meaning just 2 chapters earlier. So that gives you one good reason for accepting this interpretation. Second, the word for birth here, by the way, is itzah. It's like Y-T-S-A, and is more like go forth. So, and if her children go forth. What this word never refers to is a miscarriage or an abortion. Literally ever. When it refers to a birth, it refers to live children going forth or coming out from the womb, which is what they do naturally, right? So for example, in Genesis 25:25, "And the first came out, red, all of him like a hairy robe, and they called his name," anybody want to guess? Esau, right? There's the word. You find the same thing in Genesis 38 verses 28 to 30. It's there as well. So it doesn't mean abort or miscarry. All right. So that's the second reason. You wouldn't want to interpret it that way. And here's the third. The natural way to take this is to say the child goes forth and there is no injury to the child or the mother. It doesn't, notice that when you really look at it closely, it doesn't say, right now I'm talking about the child, but now I'm talking about the mother. Did you catch that? Instead, if you look at the way that it is structured, it's just assuming both of them. That's the natural way of reading it. So the child goes forth and there's no injury to the child or to the mother. So the writer could have said something like this. He could have inserted the Hebrew law, which is L-A-H. Are y'all liking this Hebrew tonight? Is this fun? Are we having fun? They could have put the word law, L-A-H, to specify the woman.
But they didn't.
And they did not. If her children go forth and there is no injury, and it would be to her. But it didn't say that. It just said what? There is no injury. So the natural reading of it is it's just talking about both. It's left general. And so there's no reason to exclude the child at the expense in that situation. Now I bring up this passage in Exodus 21 because it's the one that's debated. You know, you go over to Psalm 139, "You knit me in my mother's womb," Jeremiah 1:5 and whatnot. It's, well, I mean, what do you do with that, right? This one you can see where people are like, well, hold on, pump the brakes just a little bit, right? It seems like it's making a distinction here, except it isn't, right? I just wanted you to see that. Now, I want to get into a little bit of background here on just some things, just practically a little bit. Background information regarding abortion. This is about 1.3 million lives each year. Nobody, by the way, is wondering whether or not it's a human being, right? Nobody's wondering if there's a dog in there. We know what we're dealing with. So it's about 1.3 million lives every year.
I think they say that it has the possibility.
There's going to be a distinction I'll make here in a little bit. Okay. Nobody's wondering, is it a human being, though? All right.
In the U.S., you're talking
about? Yeah. Now, here's an eye popper, right? So I've done a lot of work with the Human Coalition. I think they do great work. We partner here with Family Promise and Crisis Pregnancy Centers of Houston to help women that are dealing with a crisis pregnancy. So we believe in helping people make the right decision rather than just talk at them to make the right decision. Say it, but you know what I mean? Here's something that was interesting. If just one family in every 3 churches in the United States adopted a waiting child, every waiting child in the U.S. would be adopted. Does that blow your mind?
That's waiting children.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to make a point about the children that are already there, right? One family in every 3 churches in the U.S. adopted a waiting child. Every waiting child in the U.S. would be adopted. Now, it's just 1 in 3. Now, you can understand why I'm bringing this up, right? Is because you have options here. Is basically my point. You have some options here. And I want to be really clear here. There is nothing about the morality of abortion that hinges on whether or not there is a waiting line of people to adopt. That is not what I'm saying. Because what if there's nobody wanting to adopt? Does it all of a sudden make it fine? I am not saying that, right? But I am making, and this is why I said I want to start with just something practical here. I am making an important point. But you do have options, right? You do have options. You have plenty of families that are looking for a child, that many of them can't have one of their own. I just wanted to point that out. 52% of abortions occur in women that are under 25 years of age. That part probably doesn't surprise you. The abortion ratio for unmarried women is 510 for every 1,000 live births. 22% of all pregnancies are ending in abortion. 64% of women polled said they felt pressured to get an abortion. 64%. There was a situation when I was pastoring in North Carolina, and I had stopped by the Human Coalition. They had an office up in Raleigh, and I'd stopped by. And they came and got me as I was there, and they said, there's a young lady that I think could use some help. And I said, okay. So I stopped the meeting I was in, I went over, and I was meeting with her and just talking, and so what's going on? She was a student at NC State. She had found that she was pregnant. And she said, I don't want to abort this kid. And I said, okay, well, what would be the reasons that you would? And she said, if I carry through with the pregnancy, my parents already said that they would cut everything off, including any funding I have for school. That would be an example of pressure. Some of the other pressures are the person that impregnated her is not going to be around to help out with what he contributed to. And so they're sitting there with the legitimate, like, how does this work? Like, how do I feed this kid? How do I clothe this kid? Right? You feel the pressure. However, that said, an overwhelming 80% of women indicated that if they had the support they needed to raise the child, they would have never considered an abortion. Over 80%. So I just want to paint a little bit of a picture up front for you. Most women are not naturally inclined to abort. If the data is correct. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not there. Some are. I'll be fair. Some are. But the overwhelming majority of women, that is not where they first go. They're just trying to figure out how to make it happen. And if they don't get to the place where they go, I see how this could work, then they start considering other possibilities. So with that in mind, one of the things that I've done, and we do here, and I think Heather Wolf, she does a great job with this as we partner with crisis pregnancy centers, is we try to remove every obstacle that a woman has. That's what we try to do. And if that meant, hey, gang, there's this lady that is pregnant, short of cash, we're going to throw her a baby shower. That will be a way of removing an obstacle because she sees this is possible, right? If you can remove the obstacles, most women are going to say, I want to do this. I just need to know that I can. I just need to know that I can. That said, you have the other percentage that's often, like you've seen testimonies in Hollywood, for example, where literally one actress got up, I think at the Academy Awards, but I might be wrong, and said that her abortion is what made that possible. Well, because if she had had the kid, then she would have never gotten to go forward with her career. Can you see the difference between the two that I'm talking about here? Those kinds of folk, they fall in the minority. They really do. At least with regard to just everyday women and the decisions that they're facing. Now, so let's make sure that we identify what the issue actually is. The disagreement is not usually on the moral principle. If you remember when we started at the beginning of this semester, I said you need to make sure that you're on the same page with what you're talking about. You need to make sure that your definitions are correct, that you're not talking past each other with what you mean by something, right? You need to have your facts in order. Sometimes you just need more information to make a good judgment, right? Factual issues. But the other is sometimes you just have a genuine moral disagreement with somebody. Y'all remember that? Sometimes we're not actually disagreeing on the moral principle. For example, the moral principle might be something like this. It is wrong to take an innocent human person's life. Most people would say, I completely agree with that. And here, and maybe this is where you were going with it, Charles, the main point of the argument, at least most of the time, is when does a biological human become a person? That's where it's mainly at. Not, and this is what I was saying before, not she's pregnant, but I wonder if it's a cat. Well, nobody's going there, right? Everybody knows that the life in the womb is biologically human. Nobody is questioning that. It's when does that become a person? That is often, not always, but mostly where this has gone. And notice when you talk about a person, you talk about someone that has a sense of self. Does that make sense? They have a sense of self, of their existence, making choices, and those kinds of things. And somebody like a Peter Singer, who I've mentioned before, would say the life in the womb is just not there. It's biologically human, but it's not a person.
Sentience?
Well, sentience is usually connected to it. Yep, that's exactly right. Now, to be fair, Peter Singer would have no problem with infanticide either. So the child is born, he doesn't necessarily have a problem with terminating that child's life even then. So, let's move on.
Humans aren't people till they're 30 years old.
Be careful, girl. Be careful. Prefrontal cortex going on in the front row. So here's where the debate sometimes goes. Is personhood, skip humanity, but is personhood, is this at conception? Or is it at some other point in the natural development of the child? That's mainly the question. And to point on this, the essence of the fetus is unchanged during pregnancy and frankly even beyond birth. You ever thought about that? The constant growth process and development continues from conception to adulthood. You were doing this well outside of the womb, right? You were doing what you naturally do. So, what are some suggestions here with this? Let's think about this. Personhood begins with sentience. This is the word that Charles brought up. But if you want to put it in kind of a catchphrase, able to feel pain. Able to feel pain. Now, by the way, the science behind this is actually able to feel and comprehend pain. The science behind this has become more acute over the last years because, in fact, the child in the womb can. It can. But as the argument used to go, if the fetus cannot feel pain, then there's no loss due to abortion. But there is, so you can kind of see the argument, right? There's an ethicist named Scott Ray, and he said this. He said, but this confuses the experience of harm with the reality of harm. You get the difference that he makes? This confuses the experience of harm with the reality of harm. Think of the recent case of a comatose patient who gave birth. I don't know how many of you saw that. But how'd she get pregnant? She was in a coma. Well, somebody got arrested. That's the short story, right? Now, but she was in a coma. So she wasn't in a place where she could experience the pain. Does that make sense? But it doesn't mean, if you want to make the distinction that Scott Ray was trying to make, the experience of harm, well, that wasn't there, but the reality of harm was. Do you see the difference between the two? And so with Ray, he was like, I think we need to kind of hold that distinction up. Or you can even think of a paralyzed man whose leg gets amputated. You see what I mean? It's not like he has the ability to feel the pain, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a reality there. Scott Ray says...
There was a lawsuit where a guy that was paralyzed couldn't feel his legs. The heater in his seat malfunctioned, and he had like third-degree burns on his legs, and he sued the automaker.
So a guy had third-degree burns on his legs, and he sued the automaker?
But he didn't feel it.
But he didn't feel it. Oh, okay. Yeah, that would be another example. Yeah, exactly. The reality of harm versus the feeling of harm, right? The feeling is not necessarily... the reality is not necessarily reducible to the feeling, is basically the point that Ray is making. So maybe others would say, well, what if we just said all this starts at birth? Think about this. There is no difference that exists between the fetus the moment before its birth and the moment right after its birth. There is no actual difference, except for one thing, location. Now the location has changed. But if you're talking about the fetus itself, there's absolutely no difference. So this is why somebody like a Peter Singer would be like, Yeah. So, to be consistent, he doesn't have any problem with infanticide. Literally the taking of the life of the child after the child has been delivered. And notice that you even have, in some cases, no extraordinary measures that are being given to save a child that has been delivered from the mom when an abortion was desired. They actually let the child die on the table. You're already seeing cases like that. You get the idea. So, in thinking about this, and I remember a conversation I had on a plane. I was flying out to California. This was some years ago. And I was going to speak at a conference, not about this. And sitting next to a guy, he was an atheist. We ended up striking a conversation because it was quite a long flight. And, this came up. And he was like, well, I bet I know what your position is. And I said, well, you might. You might. And we laughed. But I said, something that I want you to think about, and I kind of jotted some things down here. If somebody ever suggests to you that human beings are not persons, I want you to challenge them on some notes in history where that kind of thinking is gone. Now think about this with me for just a second. If you look at the law, and I just jotted a few things down for you here, where there was a separation of personhood from humanity, which is what this argument is saying. It has never been for good ends. Literally not once. Or that I've been able to find. Not once. Consider, I'll give you 5 examples. All right? In 1858, the Virginia Supreme Court, quote, "In the eyes of the law, the slave is not a person." They're human, they're not a person. 1881, in the American Law Review, an American Indian that is, an Indian is not a person within the meaning of the Constitution. Yeah, have any of y'all read this before? 1928, in the Supreme Court of Canada, no comments about Canada. The meaning of qualified persons does not include women. That was 1928. By the way, last week we talked about euthanasia. The very next day, Justin Trudeau in Canada talked about euthanasia. Did y'all see that? Literally the next day. Whereas if you are considering taking your own life, we have a line for you to call. And I thought, I just talked about this last night. But anyway, here's some more. 1936, the German Supreme Court said the Reichsgericht itself refused to recognize Jews as persons in a legal sense. 1997, the Supreme Court of Canada. The law of Canada does not recognize the unborn child as a legal person possessing rights. I just thought I'd throw that last one in there. I give you the other 4 examples to make what I think is an important point. Anytime that there has been a separation between human and person, it has gone towards something like that. Does that make sense? It has never been toward good. And even when you look at some of the justifications for the American slave trade, did you happen to notice that there was a distinction that was made between a human and a person? Right? So there is some history here. So here's what I want us to do. I want to jump into some arguments that are often made against the pro-life view. And this is one of the main ones that you'll see out there. Here you go. Men cannot speak to issues about what a woman does with her body. Have you heard that? My body, my choice. So as the argument goes, we're dealing with a woman's body, and so men are, by definition, ruled out of the conversation. I'll say I find that convenient. Here's why. Men can, in fact, speak the truth about women's issues. Men can speak the truth about women's issues, especially if they have knowledge to do so. Like a doctor, for example. Maybe a male doctor might actually know more about this than a woman knows about her own body. So gender is not what makes someone able or unable to speak to an issue. Either way, so for example, not every man needs to be speaking to the issue because the man might actually not know what he's talking about. Right? I'll say that. But you are not wrong on the issue in virtue of being a man. And that, to me, is a big difference. Here's why. Is because truth is not gender specific. That is not the way the truth works. When you think about the truth, this is what it is. The truth is when you have a matching relation between the way the world is and what you believe. Did you catch that? When you have a matching relationship between the way the world actually is and what you believe about the world. And when what you believe and the world actually match, we have a word for that. True. It's true. That's what the truth is. It is not gender specific. I have long thought that this move, when you say it is my body, my choice, or you're a man and you have no right to speak to this, that's basically a way of not engaging the issue at all. It's a way of not engaging the issue at all. By the way, this is exactly what the feminist arguments are trying to decry, by the way, when you think about it, that we shouldn't privilege people because of their gender. And I'm like, well, then don't. Either way. I mean, if the principle of it is wrong, then don't. Right? Well, maybe except for this one. Right? Well, you can't cherry pick it. So if you're saying let's don't privilege somebody in virtue of their gender, then I'd say, okay, then let's don't privilege somebody in virtue of their gender. And if they say, and I mean with regard to pay, I'd be like, that's great. You know, if she's the best one in the job, then pay her what she deserves. I have no problem with that. Just don't pull this on me when it comes to this. That is, it's inconsistent, right? Does that make some sense? So don't play it when it helps you, but pull it back when it doesn't. I'll take this one application further. We shouldn't privilege an argument simply because a woman makes it. Yes, I said that out loud. And everybody is perfectly fine. You should not privilege an argument just because a woman makes it. And here's why. Men do make good arguments. They do. Not everything that a man is doing is inherently to oppress a woman. That isn't true either, right? Sometimes people have a deep moral conviction about what is right and what is wrong, and they're trying to make a decision based on that, not on trying to usurp power over somebody. Here's a possible starter, though, because I think that's a non-starter, right? And for the way I work, I always try to find common ground and work my way out, rather than find all the places of disagreement and then be like, where do we go? I try to start, where could we possibly agree? Here's the thought, and I'll go back to my friend on the plane as I was going out to California. When the issue is uncertain, I asked him, is a good guiding rule something like this? Maybe err on the side of caution. Maybe, for the sake of argument, let's just say it's uncertain. Is this a person? Is it not? Okay? So if people aren't agreeing on it, I think it's fair to say, well, let's say we're not sure for the sake of argument. Does that make sense? Would you say a good guiding rule is, might want to err on the side of caution? Why? Because a life is in the line. And nobody's wondering that. Nobody's wondering what's on the line here. A life is literally on the line. Scott Ray, who I'd mentioned before, he gave this example that I ran into later. I was like, actually, that's a really good way to help make the point that I was making on the plane. He said this. He said, imagine that you're out in the woods and you're hunting. I could imagine that like right now. I could. And he said, you hear what sounds like a deer rustling in the woods in the same location that your friend went in. You know, I hear a rustling. Right? Well, it might be a deer. It might be your buddy. You know, what's a good rule of thumb? Maybe err on the side of caution, right? Let the deer go this time, even if it was the deer. By the way, if you go back to Roe v. Wade, this was Justice Blackmun's mistake. Well, there were quite a few, actually. But this was one of Justice Blackmun's mistakes, and I'm just quoting him here. He said, if philosophers, theologians, and physicians cannot determine when life begins, we assume it begins at birth. And I was like, or we don't. Or we don't. Why? Precisely because life is on the line. You wouldn't make this assumption in any other place. You would not. So even if in the question of viability, and for those of you that don't know, viability just means the child is at a developmental place whereby it can exist outside of the mom. Even in the question of viability, when the child can live outside of the womb, that's not the best measure for personhood either. What viability relates to is medical technology's ability to sustain life outside of the womb. It doesn't really say anything about what the essence of the fetus is. It's just saying what we can do to sustain it. Those aren't the same thing, right? So I wouldn't go there either. So what are some of the most common arguments in favor of abortion rights? I'll throw a few of them at you. and then we'll just kind of think through those here in just a second, and then we'll land the plane. Sound good? Here's one. A woman has a right to do whatever she wants with her body. Well, no, she doesn't. She doesn't. A person's right over their body is not absolute. It's just not. We already know that. In most states in the United States, prostitution is illegal. As is the use of a lot of different drugs. You don't get to just do whatever you want to, whenever you want to, however you want to. We legislate this stuff all the time. We do. Moreover, the fetus is not the same thing as the mom's body. It is its own body that for a temporary period resides within the mother. It has its own unique DNA, and it has that from the time that the egg and the sperm unite. It is genetically distinct from the mom. It is physically distinct from the mom. Obviously, it's not identical, because if it's born, it's going to walk off at some point, right? It's not. It's genetically distinct, and early in the pregnancy, it has its own heart. It has its own circulatory system. It's not the mom's circulatory system. It is the baby's circulatory system. In many cases, it has a different gender than the mother. Scott Ray, who I'd mentioned before, he said, this confuses the fetus being attached to the mother as being the same thing as the fetus being a part of her in a way that makes it lose its own identity. Kind of like a tapeworm inside of a human. He said, and that, morally speaking, is just missing the mark. And I think he's right. So historically, when life and freedom, just so you know, when life and freedom are in conflict, life wins out. Earlier, I remember we were talking about different moral theories, and I talked about graded absolutism. You remember that? So the example that I gave, and all of you were very happy to lie, by the way. I said, how many of you think that lying is wrong? And like, oh yeah, and all those hands went up. And then I stuck you in a situation, and I was like, how many of you would lie? And like, heck yeah, just like that. I mean, so the Nazis are at the door, hey, are the Jews in your house? And you're like, well, they are, but I ain't telling you that. And you're like, no, they're not in here. Liar. Why? And the answer is because you valued something more than something else. They were in conflict with each other. And so, as a rule of thumb, because somebody said, well, how do you know which values are more important than the others? And I said, a good rule of thumb is this. When the others depend on the other one, that one is more important. Did you catch that? So you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'll give you an example. Those are three. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you don't have life, you have no liberty and you have no pursuits. Life is more fundamental for the other two to even exist, or for you to participate in them, or for you to act on them. It's more foundational. It's more fundamental. I think that helps make the point. So when life and freedom are in conflict, life should win out. It should win out. And if the fetus is a person, then very few freedoms exist that take precedent over the right to life. Very few. Very few. Now, one of the things that comes up is, well, what about cases of rape? The first thing that I want to say is this. That doesn't represent statistically a very significant number. I'm not being cold. I'm trying to relay some information right now. So what you don't do is say, for a woman that had a consensual sexual relationship that ended in a pregnancy, and then say, but I'm going to take my moral cue from a woman that was forced into sex and resulted into a pregnancy. We're not talking about the same thing. Like right off the bat, we're not talking about the same thing. One of the things that people have to be open to when they go into a consensual sexual act is that a child might happen, right? You might want to think about it. But in the information, this comprises less than 2% of women who had an abortion that became pregnant. Less than 2. It was 1 point something, but I forget what the digit is. It's 1 point something percent. My friend Paul Copan said this, and I think you get where he comes from. He said, we don't give the death penalty to a child for the sins of the father. And so while the situation is serious, and while the situation is sad, and while there is brokenness in the situation, you want You want the church, you want her to find healing. You want the church to be a part of that story of healing. But, to Paul Copan's point, it doesn't mean that you want to end the life of the child because of how the child came into existence. Is that right to the child? And especially when, as we talked about before, there might be some other possibilities where the child could be adopted. And again, I'm just talking pragmatically there. You get the point. And so if the fetus is a person, then it's difficult to see how taking another person's life is morally acceptable practice in order to alleviate the mental distress of another person. And, some of the arguments are this child is going to be a physical reminder of the fact that she had been sexually assaulted. And one ethicist said she's probably never going to forget that. She's probably never going to forget that. It doesn't mean she can't heal from that. Right? It doesn't mean she can't heal from it. But if the fetus is a person, because we're talking about a moral situation here, it's difficult to see how taking another person's life is a morally acceptable practice in order to alleviate the mental distress of another person. Or Robertson McQuilkin, a Christian ethicist from some years ago, he said, it is better to suffer harm than to inflict it. Better to suffer harm than to inflict it. So some quick thoughts on the right to privacy, because I know that one comes up as well. Has this been helpful at all? I know we're kind of going, we're going kind of fast, but the right to privacy, I want to point this out. This is not an absolute right. In fact, I had Francis Beckwith from Baylor University. There you go. I had him here a couple of years ago, and he spoke on this. He dealt with the abortion issue and the right to privacy, and he did it really well. But I want to just say a couple practical things and kind of avoid the trenches on it. Let me give you an example. So the right to privacy. If my private belief allowed for me to own slaves, have 12 wives, discriminate against blacks, murder Jews, I'm betting this. The same persons that argue from the 14th Amendment for a right to privacy would probably like to legislate against those practices. And I doubt that what they would be satisfied with is me saying this. Well, those are my private beliefs. I find it very unlikely that any of them would say, yeah, what do I do with that? Because what they would do with it is they would legislate against it. And have. And rightly so. Rightly so. But it only goes to prove the point. The right to privacy is not absolute. It is not. It is tied up in the fact that we live in community with one another. It's not the rugged individualism that a lot of people make it out to be. And so the key questions, people say, whose rights? The right to life of the infant or the mother's lesser right to something else might be a good way to capture it. You want me to repeat that one more time? When somebody says, whose rights? The right to life of the infant or the mother's lesser rights to something else. Especially when, I think, if I got it right, 86% of the abortions that are out there, or higher, are for convenience. This is going to be difficult. It will be. I'll be honest with you, Wendy and I have 4 children. It's difficult. We're tired. We're tired at the end of the day. That doesn't mean that because of the burden that the 4 girls have brought on us at times, and everybody that's a parent, you can say it, it comes with it. It's all right. It's hard. But we've never gone there with it. You know, Wendy, there's really only one way to make this right. Kaylee's got to go. A little bit of a lighter moment out of it. But I hope, we'll edit that part out. But yeah, Kaylee's going to watch it and be like, hey, what'd you pick me for? We know you meant Avery. Oh, man. But I do hope that helps to make the point, right? Even though I say that in jest. So those are really the main arguments that are out there. And I'm going to bet this. We have a presidential election cycle coming up in the not too distant future. I'd be willing to put money down the questions coming up. What do you think? It's coming up. Here's what I'm going to encourage you to do. Listen and see if one candidate basically echoes the arguments that I just made in favor of abortion rights. Even in the way that they use the language, notice what they don't call it. They don't call it killing, even though it is. It is. I mean, it is killing, biologically, if nothing else, it is killing a human life. They don't refer to it as that. What do they refer to it as? Reproductive rights. Reproductive rights. Any effort, by the way, to identify the child as a child, it's almost never there. Almost never there. Just watch. And if I'm wrong, say, you were wrong. And I'll be like, I'll take it. I was wrong. But I'm willing to go out ahead of it, pretty well ahead of it, and think this is where they're going to go when they do it. The difference is you now have a way to think through it, right? There's more, but I thought that was enough for a night. So, was this helpful?
Yes.
Okay, then I'm going to land the plane, friends, and I'm going to cut you loose. Hey, I've had a lot of fun, and thanks again to Ed for recording this and dropping this up. Again, if you want to go to Woodridge's YouTube page, go for it. You can watch all the ones before. I think I had a lot of fun with you this fall. It was fun. I'm not doing this in the spring though. We're going to Thessalonians. We're going to do the Bible, and so come on in, and we're not going to record it. We're just going to drop down, and it's going to be real casual. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So I invite you to come and be a part of it. I also invite you to come and worship with us on Sunday. It's Christmas. And so let's worship Jesus and make much of Him. He's good, isn't He? He is good. And so I'm going to pray and let you go, my friends. But thanks for being a part of it with me. It's been a journey. Hopefully helpful to you, though. That was my goal. We're thankful, Lord. I thank you for every single person that is here. And the things that we considered tonight, it's difficult. It hits us in the thick of our experience. Our hearts really do hurt for people that find themselves in a pregnancy and they don't know what to do. Our hearts hurt for them. But I pray, Lord, we pray for your intervention. I pray that for a woman that is in a crisis pregnancy, that you would help them to see that there is beauty in life. And that the church would rise up and to be a love and support to help them make the right decision. And then I just pray for the people that maybe that we know that don't agree with us on this, that you would just give us opportunities to have good conversations with them. This is important. It's important. But I also pray that you would help to bring to bear the things that we've considered tonight, so that it can be of good use for somebody to reconsider what it is that you have done as you formed us in the womb, created us in your image, and said that life is good. And I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, my friends.